Jonathan Sacerdoti, i24 News European correspondent, joining us from London. Jonathan, but let's start first of all, though, with this plan, not just to try and combat terrorism with anti-terrorist measures, but also I wanted to check with you, because we discussed it in the first half hour of this show, about the French actually coming out and saying that part of the plan is also to interlace the people who, might turn into extremism into society and create jobs. How is that being reacted to in and around Europe?
So this is quite a multi-layered problem, and Europe seems to just about be waking up to it, finally. And that is to say, there is this issue of terrorism spreading across France and Europe at large, and a question of how on earth governments can deal with this and what intelligence can do in order to guide that reaction. So what we're seeing now in France is a realization that those who've been to the Middle East from France to receive some sort of terror training are a fundamental part of that threat, but also that there's a more basic problem, which is that of what they call radicalization. A strange word, because it's often used in the passive sense that people were radicalized as if they had no control over it, a bit like catching a cold. However, what they're now looking at are ideas as to how people can be prevented from adopting this radical Islamic ideology, which seems to inspire so many of these terror attacks that are now taking place in different parts of Europe. So it's a multi-layered approach that it's needed, and that's what they're talking about now. So to many, this is quite a refreshing idea, but of course, it remains to be seen if it will be followed through properly and if it will, of course, be successful. If
it will be successful, and obviously not something that happens overnight. I think, the thing that the Western world tends to forget is that processes and things take time. Many welcome that plan. But speaking of not just the summit that begins today, that interlaces also the Arab world within it, and we'll touch on that in a second, there's a plan also to collect and share data on airline passengers traveling in and out of the EU, which was blocked by lawmakers last year due to privacy concern. Is that about to be reversed? And that's something that actually, and I'm glad Tony's here as well, sounds a little bit like what was, like the United States in many ways. What are the reactions to that in the UK? Because I think infringement on privacy is going to be raised as a concern by all citizens on the continent, isn't it?
Correct, and there's a couple of layers to that as well, which is that certain parts of the European Union are much easier to cross from one country into another. Great Britain, of course, has water all around it, and also you do need your passport still to come into the UK. We are not part of that open borders system where you can just cross into the UK without a passport. There are parts of Europe where you don't need your passport, and that makes free movement much easier without as close detection or the possibility of close intelligence. So it is, of course, essential that different European states and the European Union as a collective come together to realize that if they can monitor people's movements around the continent, especially then with those who are leaving to go to Syria and Iraq, often through Turkey, they're going to be more able to follow the people who are more likely to be coming back and pursuing terrorist aims within Europe. I think that's become something that most people have realized is essential. I don't think there is a lot of resistance to the idea that that's one of those, let's say, slight infringements on liberty that people might be willing to give up, to let go, so that they can actually feel safer in their own homes and in their own places of work and in their own public streets. Of course, it's not necessarily a human right that we should be able to travel around completely undetected within a continent and between continents either. So I'm not sure that this itself necessarily rests on ideas of civil liberties either.
Right. And all these dealings with the community, with the summit coming up today, et cetera, when it comes to the Jewish communities of Europe, there's not real specific touching on societies. Well, we've heard, Frans Timmermans, Vice President of the European Commission, said they say, societies who are vulnerable because we are open societies. I mean, is there also a dealing with the Jewish community of Europe when we're looking at the summit coming up today or in and around, the continent that you're at and the risk that they're at?
Well, the summit today in London, John Kerry flying in and meeting with Philip Hammond is mostly focused on IS, but of course, so-called Islamic State. But of course, the secondary effect of that is that there are people out there who are Europeans or who have European citizenship or were born in Europe who are training and pose a threat when they do come back. Regarding the Jewish community and other minority groups like that, there is an increased move, finally, again, many are saying, across Europe, to try to reassure Jews that there is actually a seriousness about looking after them and keeping them safe. What we saw in Paris just over the last couple of weeks with that brutal attack in the kosher supermarket put the fear into a lot of Jewish people, not just in France, but even over here in the United Kingdom. There's been acres of coverage of the idea that anti-Semitism is rising even in Great Britain, though the situation is far better, and also the sense that Jewish people are now on high security alert. That means they're looking after themselves more thoroughly. The TV news here covering stories of Jewish institutions with high security.
Right, but high security, but again, as you said in the report that you were part of publishing, put the light on, shed light on that. Sadly, all the time we have. When we come back, thousands of the classified U.S. Air Force documents on UFOs now available online.